Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us for Newsmakers. I'm KC Counts. June is Pride Month, and on this episode of Newsmakers, we'll be joined by State Senator Carrie Hamblen and PFLAG Las Cruces Chapter President Ryan Steinmetz to discuss issues facing the LGBTQ+ community and how the state of New Mexico addressed some of those issues during this year's legislative session. We'll also hear about the significance of Pride Month and its history, as well as what Pride Month activities mean to the community. Senator Hamblen, welcome back to KRWG Public Media.
Thank you for having me, Casey. It's
good
lovely
to see
be
you.
Here.
We've seen you on Zoom a few times over the last couple of years, but it's been a while since I've been able to say hello in person.
Yeah, and it's been a while since I've been in these studios, so it's nice to be here.
And Ryan, it's been about a year since you were with us in the studio.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for coming back.
Of course.
And of course, there is a lot happening. Even just as we were sitting down to have this conversation, there are things in states across this country that are occurring. And so we have a lot to dive into today. But I want to begin with the history of Pride and where things all began. Ryan, do you want to start?
Sure. Pride Month in June is to commemorate the 1969 Stonewall riots, which is the riots in a bar there in New York City, and basically starting the modern LGBTQ rights movement. So every June is a time when people get together and celebrate being queer, being LGBTQ+. And we happen to celebrate here in southern New Mexico. We do celebrate with the traditional month of June, but we celebrate our big Pride celebration in October, just because it's cooler and less things going on in the community. So,
well, June is our hottest month, so that certainly makes a lot of sense. Carrie, maybe you can paint a bit of a picture for us of what happened at Stonewall.
So it was, just a little bit of a backstory is that Stonewall Inn was actually owned by the mafia, and the Genovese family is what they bought the Stonewall Inn. They decided to make it a gay bar, and but regularly what would happen is that the cops would raid the bar, and the owners of the Stonewall Inn would have liquor in a car off site in case the cops acquired all of that so that they could resume operations. But it was very common for the police to raid the gay bars, and it was at the breaking point for this particular bar, this particular community, on the night of June 28th, 1969, and it actually started at about 1:20 in the morning. And one of the things that we want to make sure, and I think Ryan and I both are really aware of this, is to acknowledge that it was drag queens actually who started that. It was Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. There were a couple of other folks who decided to say, we're not going to take it anymore. And so the community decided to stand back and stand up against the police, and this started a series of riots for a couple of days. And what it wound up doing was really kind of uniting this community that typically had to be underground or secret. And so this was an opportunity for them to say, we're not going to take it anymore. So after those couple of days of riots, they were continuing, but what it prompted was the following year is the Christopher Street Parade, which was really kind of what we see as the first public display of community, of the queer community. And we use the term queer because it's an umbrella term, because there are so many different letters to our alphabet that, many of folks who are maybe our age and older are used to that being a derogatory slur. But like many communities that are oppressed communities, minority communities, they take those slurs back. And we see queer studies in colleges all over the country. And so there's that term. So I want to put that out there, is that when we use the term queer, we are referring to everybody in this alphabet. And so it was a great way of uniting the queer community, of showing that we're not alone and that we deserve equality just like everybody else.
Ryan, would you say that maybe that was a beginning of organizing as well, and the formation of groups around the country?
Well, I think there's a long history of organizing that happened prior to the Stonewall riots. Different groups all over the country, even in the 1800s, even were working together to organize around queer rights. But I do think that is the start of the modern LGBTQ rights movement, and probably the most well known for all of us in our history of us living today, because many of the people that I work with actually lived through that time, right? And so that's what we see as the modern gay rights movement.
And I want to talk a little bit, Carrie, about progress that happened from that point, let's say through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of movement there was over those 3 decades?
Well, it's fascinating because I think, like with any civil rights movement, I want to be very clear, is that the women's suffrage, the civil rights movement that we saw because of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, the gay rights movement, they all are very unique in their own struggles, and we want to make sure that we recognize that. The common thread for all of that is people were being treated differently because of who they were. Women were being oppressed, their vote didn't matter. African American and black folks were treated horribly because of the color of their skin and their perceived status. Gay people were also treated horribly because people just didn't feel comfortable with gay people. Although we know for centuries there have been same-sex partnerships throughout time. And I think what we saw, though, with any civil rights movement is that there are ebbs and flows. So, we have this group that starts that stands up to police brutality and assault, and they start the gay rights movement. And then there's slow movement of making sure people are protected in their jobs, that they're not going to get fired. Then there was a movement of domestic partner benefits. And so, we're seeing this now, is that, during the previous administration or previous administration at the presidential level, is that there was a great deal of support for LGBTQ or the queer community. And then we saw all of a sudden all these attacks. And so we're seeing these ebbs and flows. And so as distressing as it is part of that cycle. And this is where we see people mobilized, and we see people across the country saying, I'm going to stand up for my trans kid. I'm going to stand up, and I don't care if you're going to arrest me. This is my job as their parent, is to support them. So we do see that. But, we've seen domestic partner benefits. We've seen protection in jobs and in schools. Teachers was a big thing. I think when we were younger, it's like, oh my gosh, we've got a gay teacher, they're going to indoctrinate. There's so much more hetero indoctrination and exploitation of children than the gay community is being accused of right now. It's absolutely insulting.
Well, I want to talk about the Obama administration because he and Joe Biden both went through their own evolution in terms of marriage equality. And so obviously that was something that happened, into the 2000s. So it was 2015, the Obergefell decision. And obviously there's a lot of folks that are wondering whether that will be readdressed by this current Supreme Court. But let's talk a little bit, Ryan, about some of those evolutions of just the way people thought about the issue in terms of marriage equality and how their beliefs changed during that period of time. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I definitely attribute it to people knowing people for whom this is affecting them, right? So one of the things that I think about with my aunt, who we were talking about marriage equality and issues and things like that before anything was passed, and I said to her, I want a chance to get married, and she went back to me and she said, you know what? Wait a second, you want to get married? Well, you mean you want domestic partnership, right? No, I want marriage. I want that law to be changed, because for me, what marriage provides for me and my partner are some safeties and securities that are needed by law for us to feel safe, right? And for her, that was an evolution, that she was able to hear that and say, oh, I get it now. I get how you're affected by this, and how semantics really mean something. The law really means something. So I think it's by knowing people and knowing family members and others that are affected by these laws that change can actually occur.
And you mentioned laws, and it's great we have a lawmaker here with us today to talk a little bit about how New Mexico addressed queer rights this legislative session, and how far behind it was in terms of protections for LGBTQ plus people.
Well, I do have to clarify because I grew up in El Paso, and I moved to New Mexico in part because the NPR station at the federal level, at the national level in DC, offered domestic partner benefits to LGBTQ people. I was very selective, and we wind up developing this kind of safety radar. And I deliberately sought out an employer that would protect me, and NPR was it. And I found that in New Mexico. I found it here in Las Cruces. But also in the 90s, New Mexico was one of the states that had one of the strongest anti-discrimination clauses in the country, because even if you were perceived to be queer, you were still protected in employment, housing, and credit, right? Was it credit? It's credit. And so I knew that New Mexico was already progressive in that way. However, we've also seen, the Human Rights Modifications Act, which is a bill that I worked on this last time, that was introduced in 2003. And now, because of the legislation that was passed just in this recent session, New Mexico leads the country in being a safe space for queer and trans youth. And I'm very proud of that, because I think that's the New Mexican value, is to take care of each other, is not to exclude people because they're different from us.
And I think in terms of, what you mentioned is like over time and how policy ebbs and flows, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, if you will, having that introduced in 2003 and having it take 20 years. What took so long?
Right, so with the Human Rights Modification Act, which is House Bill 207, so you'll see it as HB 207 if you want to look it up. What that did at the time, well, there was an outdated term for people with disabilities that is no longer appropriate to use and insulting. That was in there, and there was some outdated language in terms of reference to the queer community. And so we wanted to make sure that we brought that back up again, but also to include state institutions, because I think it was the Albuquerque Public Schools that fired somebody because they were queer, but that person didn't have the pathway to go to the Human Rights Commission to file a discrimination case. And so what the modifications did is it includes any public institution that receives state money, so universities, schools, and churches. If you receive state money, you cannot discriminate against people with disabilities or people who fall under these definitions in the LGBTQ plus community. So that includes gender identity, gender, sexual orientation, so it updates those terms. And what was interesting is that the debate really centered around just giving churches the right to discriminate. And there were amendments that were tried to be made that would allow churches still to discriminate, but receive our money, our taxpayer money. And I was like, my response was, that's an unfriendly amendment. You can discriminate all you want in your church, but you can't use my money to do it, to help other people. And so that bill passed, and I was very happy when the governor signed it into law.
Ryan, I'd like to give you a chance to weigh in on your impressions of what happened during the legislative session.
Well, I think it's wonderful to have leaders such as Senator Hamblen there to be vigilant about some of these laws that also came up that did not make it through, that were anti-LGBTQ, and to be moving us forward here in the state of New Mexico. I feel very fortunate to live in the state of New Mexico and the protections that we have here, recognizing that those protections don't exist in a lot of other places, particularly right now with a lot of the states that are coming up with legislation that's meant to erase people, that's meant to erase the LGBTQ community. And I say erase because it's not only erasing the progress that the LGBTQ community has made in the last several years, but it's really erasing people. It's saying to people, you don't count, you don't matter, you are not welcome here, you cannot tell your stories here, you cannot perform here, and we can't even talk about you or mention you in our educational institutions. So I think it's really important to have leaders like Senator Hamblen who are there to to make sure that that doesn't happen here in the state of New Mexico. But I worry for kids that are growing up in the other states, and states like the state that I grew up in Ohio, what that was like for me. And so I worry about that.
Just before we sat down, a Florida judge declared the gender affirming care reversal law unconstitutional. It could get reversed by an appellate court. What this does initially is buy time for youth who are undergoing that care. Obviously in Texas, we're also watching that situation where in our neighboring state we have youth who will have to, by law, have to be, quote, weaned off of their medication. Where do you begin, Carrie, in terms of what this means to those young people and their families?
Well, we know that gender affirming care saves lives. Young people in the queer community consider suicide every 45 seconds. I just want that to sit there for a minute. 45 seconds. And we know that gender affirming care, when somebody is able to live their truth and live in the body that they feel they belong in, that it will save their lives. And so it's disappointing, it's disgusting, it's insulting, it's heartbreaking for those young people, because there are many times that they can't just leave their state. You know, it's like, you know, well, if you don't like it, leave. I mean, we've said that about New Mexico. If you don't like New Mexico, leave. But these folks can't. And so what they're doing is they are putting people at the lowest of the low in terms of when we talk about the value of a human person. And they are disregarding everything about what it means for them to exist. And I see this, you know, from a political standpoint, beside the fact that it's just a horrible, horrible assault on human rights. I look at it as, you know, we're focusing on people who are just trying to live their truth. And what we're using, and we saw this in the Bush administration, is to use gay marriage as a divider of this country. And that is what we are seeing now, is that politicians are using trans rights, anything regarding the queer community, as a divisive technique, instead of working on economic development, instead of working on homelessness, instead of working on paying our teachers more, instead of working on building up our education system. Those are being totally ignored because they want to focus on this, because they know this is a talking point and this will divide communities.
So, Ryan, where does an organization like PFLAG fit in for members of the queer community?
I think organizations such as PFLAG are here to create safe spaces. And safe spaces are so important for queer youth, for their families, to be able to find resources, find connection, find a sense of belonging. And that's what we really work to do. My work with PFLAG, we try to do a lot of education about our community too, the queer community. Whether we do that through movie nights, we do that through discussions, panel discussions, etc. But we also make a point of creating events that are welcoming to all, and specifically welcoming, reaching out to the queer community. Earlier this month, at the start of Pride Month, we had a great hike where we had 30-some people, and there was this one young man who, it was his first Pride event ever, and he was so happy to be on that hike with so many wonderful, affirming people. And I think that's what it is that we focus on, is create these safe spaces in our communities to make sure that those kids are taken care of.
So let's talk a little bit more about the activities that are associated with Pride Month, whether they're in June or October,
Sure.
and what their significance is to the community.
Well, for example, later on this month, we are going to be doing a Pride Produce pop-up. That's a tongue twister, where we're targeting the queer community. There's a higher level of food insecurity for the LGBTQ community, so we are having that at Peace Lutheran Church on June 16th. And giving out free produce bags for folks. We're also doing a movie night on June 22nd, Thursday at 6 o'clock, Pieces of Us, and it's going to be talking about queer community, people in the queer community that have experienced violence and have risen above that. We'll have our Pride celebration in October, the first week of October, really. And this year is really exciting. The big Pride celebration is going to be happening on October 7th, but we are going to have, and this is really cool, we're going to have a Pride parade this year. We've had a Pride march for several years, and we've had wagon parade kind of going on the sidewalk. We're going to have an actual Pride parade going down the street this year, and we're excited about that.
All right, and I'd like to move on now to a topic that kind of came to awareness for many of us just within the last few years, last decade for sure, and that's pronouns. And so I think that a lot of people are confused by how to use them for themselves and how to address others. And so I'd like to address that today and have you talk a little bit about the evolution of pronouns.
Sure. I mean, my pronouns are she, her. There are people from the Latinx community who also add ella or él. Since I'm horribly white, I don't feel it's appropriate for me to do that. But what I think, it's interesting because we've seen popular figures, and it's been very disappointing to see them make fun of the use of pronouns. The actress Gina Carano did that, and she saw a lot of backlash from that. And she should have, because it was inappropriate. The reason why we use pronouns, and I think it's always important just to ask, what are your preferred pronouns? Or what are your pronouns that you'd like me to use? Because when we say preferred, and we've got to get out of the habit of that, that's kind of implying that it's a
choice.
An option.
It's a choice,
Yeah.
right? And so it's always best to be, if you want to be sensitive to somebody who's queer in your life, you can just ask, what pronouns would you like me to use? And the reason why is because it acknowledges people in the gender that they prefer. It's important to do that because it makes sure that people know that they are seen and that they are supported and that they are respected. And so you don't always have to use it, but it's always a good move to ask folks, what pronouns would you like me to use? If you see that there's a situation where it's not kind of evident.
Absolutely.
And first of all, my pronouns are he, him. And I think for pronouns, for me, it's about, again, creating safe spaces, what PFLAG was really doing a lot of. That's how you create a safe space, by making everybody feel welcome and being hospitable. It's about what I call the platinum rule. We all know the golden rule is treat others the way that you would like to be treated. And the platinum rule is going one step further and saying treat others how they want to be treated. And just as Carrie was saying, making people feel seen and heard is so important for people to, and really we found using those pronouns, the pronouns that people want to be using, lowers issues of depression and anxiety and suicidality for those trans kids. So I think it's really important to be using that.
We've talked a little bit about mental health. We've heard Governor Greg Abbott of Texas refer to the desperate need to address mental health when it comes to gun crimes. And obviously, every 45 seconds to have a young person who's queer considering suicide, that is dramatic. Why is that community at so much greater risk? Because
we have people like Greg Abbott who are saying you don't deserve to exist. We have people like Ron DeSantis who are saying we're going to go ahead and do everything we can to erase you. We have people who are public leaders, who are in the public eye, who are disregarding this community. Obviously, it's very passionate to me because it just infuriates me that people feel that they have a right to do that, to just totally disregard a population that is contributing to their community in a variety of ways. And so when we have that happening, when we hear that rhetoric or those narratives that say we don't deserve to exist, why wouldn't people be depressed, experience social anxiety, have suicidal ideations, have issues of keeping their own jobs, of being able to live in their homes? Why wouldn't that happen? Because that is, it's awful.
We can even talk about it in terms of, the smaller family unit. And I think sometimes even when families are supportive, regardless, it's still a pretty difficult thing to say to your parents.
Sure.
Say as a teenager, right?
Oh man, it was definitely difficult for me to come out to my parents, even though I knew they would be supportive. But I'm so glad that they have been supportive, because for so many people that's not the case. It's not a good story for them. But I do think that families exist in hearing this rhetoric. They might hear it not only in media or through politics, but they're also hearing it in churches. And I think it's important to recognize that there are lots of churches that, first of all, do not that are supportive of LGBTQ folks and do not propose that rhetoric. But it perpetuates this same challenge for kids growing up in this environment and trying to come out and trying to be who they are.
In fact, there was reporting just today on the increase in the number of faith-based organizations that are taking part in Pride celebrations around the country. Carrie, do you think that's a new frontier?
Well, I think in Las Cruces it's not, because I used to run, Ryan took over PFLAG when I stepped down. I used to run Southern New Mexico Pride, and I was the vendor coordinator. And I was just telling somebody this the other day that we had 9 religious organizations at Pride that represented various faiths. And it was so heartwarming for me to see those faith-based groups there supporting their LGBTQ brothers and sisters and family members.
State Senator Carrie Hamblen, this 26 minutes or so sure did go by in a flash. Thank you so much for coming to share your perspective with us on this important topic.
Thank you very much.
And President of PFLAG Las Cruces, Ryan Steinmetz, so good to have you back again. Thank you so much for coming back. And that's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition, 5 a.m. to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now from noon to 2. And All Things Considered from 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org. And we'd like to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Casey Counts. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.